The call came on a Wednesday morning, and I remember because I had just poured my second cup of coffee when my phone rang. It was my brother. He said, "Dad's gone." Just like that, 2 words. I set the cup down on the counter and stood there in my kitchen in Asheville for a long time without moving. My father was 81 years old. He had lived a good, full life. He built things with his hands. He kept his word. He never once told me he loved me out loud, but every time I showed up at his door, he'd have a pot of coffee ready, and he'd pull out the chair closest to the window, the one he knew I liked, and that was his way. I knew. We both knew. His name was Earl. Earl Bernard Hutchins. He was a retired civil engineer from Knoxville, Tennessee, and he had spent 40 years drawing bridges and overpasses and drainage systems that most people drove over without a second thought. He died quietly in his recliner on a Tuesday night watching the Weather Channel, which is exactly how he would have wanted to go. My sister-in-law found him the next morning. I drove the 4 hours from Asheville to Knoxville that same Wednesday. My wife, her name is Diane, stayed behind. She said she had a work obligation, she couldn't move. I told her it was fine. I believed it was fine. That was my first mistake. My brother Ray and I spent 3 days doing what you do when someone dies. We called the funeral home. We went through the papers in the filing cabinet in the den. We found the will, which was simple and straightforward, the way my father was simple and straightforward. And we sat at his kitchen table and divided up the tasks without arguing, because that's what he raised us to do. Ray handled the obituary. I handled the arrangements. The funeral was on a Saturday. The church was a small Presbyterian one my father had attended for 30 years, and it was full. Not packed like a wedding, but full in the honest way where everyone in the pews actually knew the man they came to mourn. His old colleagues from the county office were there. His neighbor Phil, who had brought my father's mail in every week for the past 2 years when my father's hip was bad. 3 women from his Sunday school class who had taken turns driving him to appointments since he gave up his license. People who had no reason to be there except that they wanted to be. I gave the eulogy. I had written it the night before at his kitchen table with a glass of bourbon and his reading glasses on because I'd forgotten mine. And I sat there writing in that handwriting that looked nothing like my own and thought about the gap between what we mean to say to people and what we actually get around to saying. I talked about the bridges. I talked about how he used to take Ray and me to job sites on weekends when we were boys, and how he'd stand at the edge of a concrete form and explain load distribution the way other fathers explain baseball. I talked about the time he drove 6 hours in a snowstorm to help me move into my first apartment and never once mentioned it again. I talked about the chair by the window. Somewhere in the middle of it, I had to stop, not dramatically. Just a pause, a breath, looking down at the paper for a few seconds until I could continue. When I looked up again, I saw Phil in the 4th row with his eyes wet, and that undid me for just a moment before I found my footing again. After the service, people came to the fellowship hall. Someone had organized food. There were casseroles and a fruit tray and an enormous sheet cake that my father would have found excessive. People told stories. His friend Victor from the engineering office told a story about my father staying late on a Friday night to recalculate a load estimate because he had a feeling something was slightly off, and it turned out he was right, and that bridge is still standing today outside of Maryville. People laughed and then went quiet. That kind of quiet that means something. Diane was not there. She had not come at all. I called her Saturday morning before the service, and she said she was still tied up with the project at work. I said it was my father's funeral. She said she knew, and that she was sorry, and that she'd make it up to me. I remember standing outside the church in my suit in the November cold, watching my breath in the air, and feeling something shift inside me that I couldn't name yet. I drove back to Asheville on Sunday afternoon. The house looked the same from the street. My car was in the driveway. The lights were off on the ground floor. I parked behind my own car, walked up the front steps, and put my key in the lock. It didn't turn. I tried again. Then I understood. She had changed the locks while I was in Knoxville burying my father. I stood on the front porch for a long moment. Then I rang the doorbell. Diane answered. She had her hair pulled back and she was wearing the blue fleece pullover I had given her 2 Christmases ago, and she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not angry, not even cold, just decided. She said, "I think it's better if you find somewhere else to stay for a while." I said, "Diane, I just got back from my father's funeral." She said, "I know. I'm sorry about your father." And then she started to close the door. I put my hand on the frame, not forcefully, just to hold the moment still for one more second. I said, "This is my house. My name is on the deed." She said, "We can work out the details through lawyers." I said, "Who is he?" She didn't say anything, but she didn't deny it either. That was its own kind of answer. I took my hand off the frame. I drove to a Holiday Inn on Merriman Avenue and sat on the edge of a bed with my suit jacket still on and stared at the wall for a long time. I want to be honest about what those first weeks were like, because this story doesn't work unless you understand the bottom. I was 63 years old. I had been married to Diane for 26 years. We had 2 daughters, Meg, who was 30, and Caroline, who was 27. I had a mortgage and a car and a financial planning practice. I had spent 22 years building from a desk in a rented office downtown to a team of 7 people in a proper suite on Lexington Avenue. I had a father who was dead and a wife who had changed the locks, and somewhere in Asheville there was a man whose name I didn't know yet, who had been in my house while I was at a graveside service in Knoxville. I called my daughters that first night. Meg answered, and I told her what had happened, and she was very quiet. And then she said, "Dad, I'm so sorry." Those 4 words from my daughter's mouth were harder to hear than anything Diane had said on the porch. Not because they hurt more, but because they were the first kind thing anyone had said to me since Wednesday morning when Ray called, and I had not realized until that moment how badly I needed to hear something kind. Caroline called back 20 minutes later. She was furious in a way that Meg wasn't, that sharp young woman's fury that goes right to the point, and she said, "She did this while you were at Grandpa's funeral?" I told her yes. Caroline said a few things about her mother that I won't repeat here, and while I can't endorse the language, I understood the sentiment completely. I retained a divorce attorney on Monday morning. Her name is Patricia, and she is small and precise and utterly unimpressed by emotional drama, which is exactly what I needed. I told her the facts. She wrote them down. She said, "Your name is on the deed, which means she cannot bar you from the property without a court order. Do you want to go back?" I thought about it. I said no, not yet. I didn't want to stand in my own kitchen with the knowledge of what had happened in it. Patricia said she understood, and we got to work. Here is the part I had not told Diane. Here is the part I had not told anyone except Ray and my attorney. When my father died, he left something behind that I had known about in general terms for years, but had never fully understood until I sat down with his lawyer, a dry-humored man named Mr. Turney. Osgood, in his Knoxville office the week after the funeral. My father had bought land, not recently. He had been buying it quietly for 30 years, starting in the early 90s when rural land in East Tennessee cost almost nothing, and nobody thought it would ever be worth much. Small parcels mostly. An acre here, 3 acres there. He kept it all in a trust he'd set up in 1998, and he never talked about it, because he was a man who believed that talking about money was the fastest way to make everyone around you behave differently. He had, over the course of those 30 years, accumulated 62 acres in 3 separate parcels in Knox and Blount counties. Mr. Osgood showed me the appraisals. The current value, accounting for what had happened to land prices in that region in the last decade, was considerable. That word, considerable, is the word Mr. Osgood used, and I will use it here too, because the number itself is still something I am getting used to. The trust passed to Ray and me in equal shares. But there was also a separate letter, not legal, not binding, just a letter my father had written in his own hand and had Mr. Osgood hold for me. He had written it 18 months before he died. He said he knew I had always wanted to do something that mattered beyond the office. He said he had watched me for years and seen that I was good at making money for other people and not particularly good at making room for myself. He said he wanted me to use my portion of the land for something I believed in. He did not specify what. He just said, something you believe in, son. Something that'll still be there after you're gone. I sat in Mr. Osgood's office and read that letter twice. Then I folded it and put it in my breast pocket, and I did not take it out again for 3 weeks. The divorce proceedings moved the way these things do, which is to say slowly and with a great deal of paper. Patricia was excellent. Diane had retained her own attorney, a man I vaguely recognized from a charity gala we'd attended 2 years ago, and the negotiations were civil in the way that things are civil when both parties understand that a judge will eventually decide whatever they can't agree on themselves. I learned the name of the man in October, about 6 weeks after I came back from Knoxville. It was a colleague of Diane's from the hospital where she worked in administration. They had apparently been seeing each other for 11 months. 11 months is a specific number. It means that whatever I thought was happening in our marriage a year ago, something else was happening alongside it. I did not confront him. I want to be clear about that. Patricia told me not to, and I also didn't want to. Not because I wasn't angry. I was angry in that deep, grinding, low-temperature way that is worse than the explosive kind, but because I had watched my father handle difficult men his entire career by simply continuing to do his work with complete competence. And the men who had underestimated him had eventually had to live with that, and I thought that was the better model. By December, the details of the property settlement were taking shape. Diane's attorney at some point in early December made an inquiry about the inheritance from my father's estate. Patricia told him that under Tennessee and North Carolina law, inheritance received during a marriage is separate property, not subject to equitable distribution, and that the trust had been established in my name prior to any marital claim. He knew this, of course. It was a probe, not a genuine argument. Patricia sent the documentation, and that was the end of that inquiry. I was in my temporary apartment on a Thursday evening in December when Patricia called me. She said that Diane's attorney had called her that afternoon with a change in position. Several positions, actually, a significant softening across the board. Patricia read me the new terms. I listened. When she finished, I said, "What happened?" Patricia said she wasn't certain, but that the shift had been abrupt and had come following some communication on Diane's end. She suggested we accept the terms and move forward quickly before anything changed again. I said yes. I found out later, from Meg, who heard it from her mother in a phone call that Meg described to me reluctantly and with visible discomfort, that Diane had received a letter that week. From Mr. Permint, Osgood's office, a formal notification of the trust settlement, which Patricia had sent as part of the discovery process. Diane had opened it in the kitchen and read the summary of the assets, and she had sat down on the kitchen floor and not gotten up for several minutes. Meg said she didn't know her mother was even home. She had stopped by to pick up some of her own things from her old room. She found her mother on the tile floor with the letter in her hand. She said it was not dramatic. She said her mother just sat there. I have thought about that image a great deal. I did not take satisfaction in it the way I expected to. What I felt was closer to something like exhaustion and sadness, and the specific grief of realizing that a person you spent 26 years trying to build something with had made choices that neither of you can undo. That's a different kind of loss than the one I drove to Knoxville for in November, but it is a loss all the same. The divorce was finalized in March. I kept the house on the merits of the deed and the settlement. I didn't want to live in it for a while, so I rented it out and kept the apartment. I saw a therapist every other Thursday. I took long walks in the mornings along the French Broad River, and I thought about my father's letter and what he had meant when he said, "Something you believe in, son." Ray and I talked about the land extensively over several months. He had his own ideas. He'd always been more entrepreneurial than me, and we went back and forth. But eventually, we came to something that felt right. There is a technical college in Knoxville that has an engineering program. It is underfunded in the way the technical programs often are, especially in rural serving institutions, and it has a construction and infrastructure track that graduates people who go on to build things with their hands and their minds in the same way my father had. We donated 12 acres of the Blount County parcel to the college foundation for a satellite training facility, a real one, with proper equipment and a workshop and outdoor learning space. We funded the endowment to run it for 20 years. There will be a scholarship in my father's name for students from first-generation families, students whose fathers, like mine, built things their whole lives without anyone making a particular fuss about it. The groundbreaking was last spring. Ray and I stood in a field in Blount County with Mr. Osgood and a woman from the college president's office and a local councilman, and we watched a backhoe turn over the first section of earth. It was cold. There were maybe 20 people there. No one gave a long speech. I had my father's letter in my breast pocket. I don't know why I brought it. I just wanted to have it with me. Afterward, Ray and I sat in my truck in the parking lot of a Cracker Barrel and split a piece of pecan pie and didn't say much. At some point, Ray said he would have hated all the attention. I said he would have wanted to inspect the drainage plan. Ray laughed and I laughed, and it was the first time in months that laughing felt like it came from somewhere real. Caroline got married last fall to a good man she met at her hospital residency. She asked me to walk her down the aisle, and I did. Meg is living in Portland now, doing something with renewable energy permitting that I understand about 40% of, but I ask about it every time we talk. Both of them are fine. Both of them are more than fine. I think about Diane sometimes, not often. She and the man from the hospital are no longer together. I heard this through Meg, who tries to give me information without editorializing, which I appreciate. I don't know what Diane's life looks like now, and I have stopped trying to imagine it. That is not bitterness. It is just the boundary between her story and mine. My story, as best I can tell, goes like this. A man buried his father, lost his marriage, found a letter, and built something with the parts that were left. It is not the story I thought I would be living at 63, but it is mine, and most days I am grateful for it. My father never once told me he loved me out loud, but he kept a chair by the window, and he wrote me a letter, and he trusted me with something that mattered to him. I think about that. I think that is more than enough. I still take my coffee on the porch in the mornings. When the light comes through the trees in a certain way, I think about him standing at the edge of a concrete form on a cold Saturday in Knoxville, explaining load distribution to two small boys who could not yet understand why it mattered. He knew it would matter eventually. He was right. He was almost always right. I would not have changed the locks. I want to say that clearly. Whatever pain I carried out of this year, I would not have done it that way. Some things you do cannot be undone, and some images stay with the person you did them to long after the anger that caused them has faded. The lawn, the cold, my good shirts in the grass. I picked them up without a word. I folded them. I drove away. That, I think, was the right thing to do. My father would have done the same. I have had a lot of time to think about what actually happened in my marriage, and the honest answer is that I don't think it collapsed the week Diane changed the locks. I think it had been listing for a long time before that, the way a house settles and shifts before anyone notices the crack in the foundation. I just wasn't paying close enough attention. That's on me, and I've made my peace with it. What I've come to understand is that the choices people make, Not the dramatic ones, but the quiet, daily ones, stack up over time into something that cannot be undone overnight. Diane made her choices, I made mine, and the outcomes we each landed on were not accidents. They were the accumulated weight of everything we had each done and not done over 26 years. I don't say that to assign fault. I say it because I think it's important to be honest about how life actually works. Actions produce consequences, not always quickly, not always visibly, but they do every time. I watched Diane spend 11 months making a decision she thought was invisible, and I watched what that decision eventually cost her. I am not glad about it, but I am not surprised by it either. What I keep coming back to is my father, not the inheritance, not the land, the man himself. Earl Hutchins never once in 81 years did anything that required him to look over his shoulder afterward. He built things that held. He kept his word. He stayed. That consistency, practiced for decades without fanfare, is what filled that church in Knoxville. That is what had Phil crying in the fourth row. That is what had a room full of people laughing and weeping at the same time over cold cuts and casseroles on a Saturday afternoon. You don't manufacture that kind of life at the end. You build it the same way my father built everything else, carefully, over a long time, without cutting corners. I think about what it means to be a man of 63 starting over. It is not the story I planned. But I have learned that the story you planned is rarely the one worth telling. The one worth telling is the one where you find out what you're actually made of when everything comfortable is taken away. And what I found is this: I am my father's son. I know how to keep going. I know how to do the next right thing even when I am exhausted and alone in a Holiday Inn with my suit jacket still on. I know how to walk into a lawyer's office on a Monday morning and face what needs to be faced. Ray and I broke ground on that training facility last spring, and when the backhoe turned over that first section of East Tennessee soil, I felt something settle in me that had been unsettled for a very long time. Not triumph, not vindication, just rightness. My father wrote in his letter that he wanted me to build something that would still be there after I was gone. We did that. And on the days when the rest of it still aches, which happens, I think about that field in Blount County and the students who will learn to build things there, and it is enough. The chair by the window is enough. The letter in my breast pocket is enough. Meg's voice saying, "Dad, I'm so sorry," in the dark on a Wednesday night, that is enough too in its own painful way. What I have learned is that enough is actually quite a lot if you are paying attention.